The gallows creaked as the last of the crowd drifted away, boots crunching in the dirt, their laughter fading like a storm that had broken its violence and left only ruin behind. The noon sun blazed merciless over the square, the rope still swaying from the timber beam, its frayed end blackened by the weight it had borne an hour before. Caleb Rowe, a drifter with dust on his hat and scars carved into his jaw, leaned against a post with no interest in the town's justice. He'd seen enough justice to know it was just a word men used for what they wanted. But as silence settled, a thick, heavy blanket over the square, he caught a sound that froze his breath. It wasn't a groan of wood, not a whisper of wind, but something else. A faint whimper, raw and small, rising from beneath the platform. He straightened slow, his muscles protesting, boots dragging in the deep dust. He stepped into the long, cruel shadow of the gallows, his eyes narrowing against the glare, trying to place the sound. There, half hidden by dust and frayed rope ends, sat a wicker basket. It was old and worn, its lid crooked, and something was definitely shifting inside. The sound came again, a little stronger this time, a tiny gasp for air. Caleb crouched, the weight of silence pressing down hard on his shoulders. He reached for it, his rough, calloused hand lifting the cover. Inside lay a bundle of cloth, ragged and stained with sweat and tears. And from within it came the sound again. A gasp, a shallow rasp of breath, as though life itself were clinging on by a single fraying thread. Caleb's chest tightened. He'd faced down guns and knives without flinching, but this sound, this tiny struggle for life, it hit him somewhere deep and forgotten. Before he could speak, before he could even think, a small voice broke the stillness right behind him. "Pa, is that baby breathing?" He turned his head slow, finding a boy no older than 10, standing wide-eyed at his side. A town child who hadn't followed the crowd, one who had stayed to watch the ugly aftermath. The boy's lips trembled, his eyes fixed on the basket as though staring at a ghost. Caleb looked back down, his gaze drawn to the bundle. He saw the tiny chest rising faint, then falling faint. A rhythm so fragile it was almost not there at all. And in that instant, he knew what the laughing, righteous crowd had walked past without a single care. The rope above swayed, a silent testament to the death they had all come to see. And yet here, right under the gallows, lay a fragile piece of life that refused to die. Caleb slid his arms beneath the bundle, lifting it from the wicker with a gentleness that surprised even him. The weight was so small it scarcely filled his palms. The child stirred weakly, a little cough rattling its throat, a sound that tore right through Caleb. The boy beside him whispered again, his voice breaking with fear and wonder. "Pa, what's going to happen to it?" Caleb's jaw clenched, the heat biting his neck, the dust stinging his eyes. He knew the answer the town would give. He knew that no baby born of the condemned, the cursed, deserved to draw breath. He glanced toward the saloon, where laughter still carried on the faint breeze, and imagined how quickly the sheriff would order the basket and its contents thrown on a fire. He looked back at the boy, then down at the infant struggling against the silence, and he felt the weight of a choice pressing like a hand at his back. His boots scraped the dirt as he stood, the empty basket abandoned at his feet. He pressed the child close to his chest, feeling the faint warmth of it, the struggle of its tiny lungs. The shadow of the gallows loomed long over all three of them. The rope swung once, slow and deliberate, as if in warning, but Caleb Rowe set his jaw and muttered low enough that only the boy could hear. "It's breathing, son, and we're not leaving it here." The sound of Caleb's vow had barely faded when heavy boots struck the boards above. A shadow spilled long and dark across the dirt, swallowing them whole. Sheriff Maddox loomed at the edge of the gallows, his hat pulled low, his face a roadmap of pride and cruelty. He was the kind of man who had ordered the rope drawn tight without flinching, who saw justice not as a balance, but as a hammer. He squinted down, his eyes narrowing to slits at the sight of Caleb holding the bundle, the boy hovering close at his leg like a nervous colt. "Put it back," Maddox growled. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the heat like iron dragged across stone. "That's the spawn of a murderer. It dies where she swung." The boy gasped, his small hand clutching Caleb's sleeve, trembling. But Caleb's arms only tightened around the bundle, the faint rise and fall of its chest a silent argument against the sheriff's command. "It's breathing," Caleb said. His tone was flat, steady, more fact than plea. It was a simple truth, laid bare in the dust. The sheriff stepped down from the gallows, his boots thudding on the hard-packed earth. The townsfolk who had started to scatter now turned back, drawn by the new tension flaring in the square. A second show was starting, and they didn't want to miss it. Mothers dragged their children behind their skirts, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Men folded their arms, their expressions hard, waiting for a spectacle, for a fight they could feed on. Maddox planted himself directly in front of Caleb, his body blocking the sun. His hand rested heavy and possessive on the grip of his revolver. His lips curled into a sneer. "You think your hands can wash its bloodline clean? Its mother cursed this town with her sins, and no man of mine will raise her get. Lay it down and walk away, drifter, before I hang you right beside it." The words slashed through the air, cruel and certain. Laughter rippled through the gathered crowd, though a new unease coiled behind their eyes. This was more than just cleaning up after a hanging. This felt different, darker. Caleb's jaw flexed, but his breath remained slow and steady. His gaze was fixed on the infant stirring against him, its tiny pale fingers curling weakly around the fabric of his shirt. He felt the boy at his side, trembling but silent, his eyes locked on him as if waiting to see if strength could be real in a world this cruel. "You had your rope," Caleb said, his voice low but carrying in the tense silence. "But this one's breath isn't yours to steal." Murmurs spread through the crowd, sharp and cutting. Maddox's face darkened, the lines around his mouth tightening with fury. "You'll defy my word? In my town?" he barked, his voice rising. "Then you'll see how long a drifter lasts when he's got no soil to be buried in." He raised his hand high, a clear signal. Two deputies who had been lounging by the saloon doors shoved their way through the crowd. They held rifles in their arms, their eyes darting nervously between the furious sheriff and the stoic stranger, holding a life where death was meant to reign. The boy at Caleb's side whispered, his voice breaking with fear, "Pa, they're going to take it." And as if on cue, the infant whimpered louder, a thin wail rising, small but piercing through the hush. It was a sound of protest, a cry for life in the very heart of death. Caleb shifted his stance, his boots grinding into the dust. His arms remained firm around the child, his gaze unflinching as the deputies drew closer, their rifles glinting in the harsh noon sun. The sheriff's grin spread cold and triumphant across his face as he barked the order. "Take it, and if he resists, hang him." The crowd leaned forward as one, a hungry, fearful beast. The square was choking with breath, held too long, waiting for the first spark of violence to shatter what little silence remained. The deputies closed in, rifles held low but ready, their spurs jingling a sharp, metallic rhythm in the tense hush. The crowd parted just enough to let them through, whispers hissing like snakes in the oppressive heat. Caleb shifted his boots in the dirt again, feeling the fragile weight of the infant firm against his chest. The boy at his side clutched his sleeve so tight that Caleb could feel the boy's knuckles digging into his arm. Sheriff Maddox barked again, his voice cracking with impatience. "Take it!" The first deputy lunged, his hands shooting out, fingers spread like claws to wrench the child away. But Caleb wasn't a statue. He turned, his shoulder catching the man square in the chest, shoving him back hard. The deputy grunted, stumbling backward and landing in the dust with a thud that drew gasps from the onlookers. The bundle in Caleb's arms whimpered, its tiny cry sharp with alarm. Caleb adjusted his hold, his rough hands startlingly gentle as he whispered low, "Easy now, little one. Easy." The second deputy saw his partner go down and swung his rifle up, the long barrel gleaming as he tried to bring it level with Caleb's chest. But before he could, Caleb's free hand snapped out, iron hard, slapping the wooden stock aside. The rifle clattered loudly against a hitching post, the sound echoing in the silent square. The man cursed, stumbling to regain his balance. And then the crowd erupted. It was a confused, chaotic noise. Some were cheering for the drifter, for his raw defiance. Others were jeering, angry that an outsider would challenge their law. But all of them were hungry for the fight they had come sniffing back for. "He's resisting the law!" Someone shouted, their voice laced with outrage. Another man spat back, his voice full of scorn. "The law's gone mad!" The sheriff's face turned a shade of purple, fury burning in his eyes as he stomped forward. His voice tore through the din. "That child's breath is cursed, and anyone who shields it shares its rope." The boy at Caleb's side cried out, his voice thin and desperate. "No, Pa, don't let him!" Caleb's jaw set like granite, his eyes narrowing to slits as he planted his boots deeper in the dust. He shifted the baby against his arm, his other hand balling into a fist that glinted with old scars, each one a story of a fight he'd survived. The first deputy staggered back to his feet, spitting a stream of blood and dust, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. But a flicker of hesitation, of doubt, showed in his eyes. The drifter's stance carried the weight of a man who had fought enough battles to know which ones truly mattered. The crowd pressed tighter, the circle closing in, a wall of shifting bodies and staring eyes. Some women hid their faces in their hands. Others leaned forward, wide-eyed, not wanting to miss a single second. Caleb's voice carried above the growing roar, steady and unbroken. "You'll have to kill me to lay a hand on this child." Silence struck hard, as if a physical blow. Every word was like a stone hurled into still water, ripples of disbelief spreading through the mob. Maddox sneered, his face a mask of contempt. He drew his revolver in one swift, practiced jerk, the steel catching the noon sun as he raised it chest high. "So be it," he snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger, the hammer clicking back with a sound that promised death. But before he could fire, a cry tore from the back of the crowd, a voice high and shrill, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Stop! You can't!" All heads turned as one. A woman was shoving her way forward, her bonnet torn, her face gaunt with grief. Her eyes were blazing with a wild, desperate fire. She stumbled into the center of the square, pointing with a trembling hand at the bundle in Caleb's arms. "That's my daughter's child," she screamed, her voice shaking but fierce. "She begged me with her last breath to see it live." The square gasped, the weight of her words crashing over them. Even the deputies froze, their rifles wavering. The sheriff's face twisted in shock and fury, his aim faltering for just a moment. The game had just changed. The woman's cry cracked through the square like lightning, her words lashing every ear as she stumbled closer, her skirts dragging in the thick dust. Her bonnet fell back completely, revealing a face hollowed out by grief, but fierce with a fire that would not be extinguished. "That's my daughter's child," she screamed again, her trembling finger pointing at the bundle shivering against Caleb's chest. "She carried it in her belly when they took her, and with her last breath, she begged me to keep it safe from him." She shot a look of pure venom at the sheriff. Murmurs exploded through the crowd, a wave of shock and confusion. People recoiled, mothers clutching their own children tighter, men trading uneasy looks as shame began to prick through their earlier jeers. Sheriff Maddox's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. His revolver was still aimed at Caleb, but now sweat beaded on his brow. "Lies," he spat, his voice raw with a sudden desperation that hadn't been there before. "Her kind cursed this town with sin, and the rope cleansed it. That babe is no blessing, it's a stain." The woman reeled as if he'd struck her, her eyes flashing with a mother's rage. "A stain? My daughter died with a prayer on her lips, and you call her blood a curse? Shame on you, Maddox. Shame on all of you." Her words struck harder than any stone, and the murmurs turned sharper, cutting away at the sheriff's authority like 100 tiny knives. Caleb held the infant tighter, feeling its fragile breaths warm against his skin. Though his face remained a hard, unreadable mask, something inside him shifted at the sight of the woman clawing truth into the poison air. "She spoke the truth," he said. His voice was steady, low but clear enough to hush the restless mob. "I've seen the gallows take guilty men, and I've seen it take those who never had a chance. This child didn't swing, and it won't." The boy at his side stared up, his eyes wide, his small voice trembling with a new hope. "Pa, she said it's got a family." Caleb's hand tightened protectively around the child, but his gaze never left Maddox. The sheriff sneered, his grip white-knuckled on the revolver. "Family," he barked, spraying spittle. "That bloodline's poison. It's rotten. Better it ends here than festers among us." His deputies shifted, their uncertainty growing. Their rifles were lowered halfway, their eyes darting between the sheriff's escalating rage and the crowd's growing unease. A rancher in the front spat a thick wad of tobacco into the dust and growled, "It's a child, Maddox, not a damn curse." Another man muttered, "We watched her swing, and not one of us lifted a hand. Maybe the shame's ours, not hers." The sheriff's face blazed a dangerous red, fury choking him. He shouted, his voice cracking, "You'll all pay if you defy me." He thrust the revolver higher, aiming it dead at Caleb's chest again. But before he could squeeze the trigger, the woman, Leora, lunged forward. She clutched the sheriff's sleeve with both hands, her voice shrill with a mixture of grief and fury. "If you kill him, you kill me too, and God himself will mark your soul for eternity." The square roared, a community torn between fear and a newfound fury of their own. The deputies faltered completely, stepping back into the press of bodies, wanting no part of this. Maddox snarled, jerking his arm free with such violence that he shoved the woman hard into the dust. Gasps tore the air as she hit the ground, her bonnet scattering away from her. Caleb's jaw set, his boots grinding into the earth. But before he could move, the sheriff leveled the revolver again, his voice a roar of pure, cornered rage. "If no one else has the gall, I'll end this myself. Drifter, you and that cursed child die right here." The square held its breath. Time seemed to stop. Sheriff Maddox's finger tightened on the trigger, the revolver steady on Caleb's chest. The infant squirmed weakly against him, as if it could feel the shadow of death hovering close. A woman screamed. A man cursed. But before the noise could swell, the gun cracked. Fire and smoke burst from the barrel in a flash that split the noon air. Leora, the grieving mother, cried out from the dust where she had fallen, covering her head. The boy at Caleb's side clutched his sleeve, his small voice breaking. "Pa!" The report of the gunshot echoed off the gallows, a deafening ring that vibrated in every chest. But Caleb did not fall. He stood his ground, merely shifting his shoulder, feeling the sting of intense heat as the bullet tore through his thick coat. It grazed flesh, drawing blood, but it missed its mark. A collective gasp erupted from the crowd. They stumbled back, their murmurs now torn between awe at the drifter's luck and dread of what the sheriff would do next. Maddox snarled, pure fury twisting his face at the side of the drifter still standing, his arms steady, the child still alive in his hold. Caleb's jaw tightened, his voice carrying like steel dragged across stone. "You missed your mark, Sheriff, and now the town's seen your law for what it is." His words cut sharper than the bullet had. Whispers hissed through the crowd, fast and angry. Faces that had been curious were now pale with shock, others flushed with a sudden, hot shame. "He aimed at a babe," someone muttered, the words catching fire. "The sheriff's lost his soul," another spat, the sentiment spreading. Maddox roared, swinging the revolver up again, ready to fire a second time. But now his deputies shifted away from him, their rifles lowering, their eyes filled with a doubt that bordered on fear of their own leader. Caleb's stance did not waver. His body was square, his boots rooted in the dust as if the earth itself held him steady. The infant whimpered, a thin, fragile cry that rose above the murmurs. That sound, so small and unbroken, silenced the crowd more effectively than the gun had. Caleb glanced down at the child, then looked back at the sheriff, his voice steady, low, yet carrying to every ear in the silent square. "It's breathing, Sheriff, and I won't walk away." The words rolled heavy, simple as truth, undeniable as the sunrise, and the square seemed to quake with it. Some people were nodding, some were openly weeping, all of them caught in the weight of a vow that no rope could ever bind. Maddox's face turned purple, veins bulging on his neck and forehead. With a raw roar of pure desperation, he fired again. This time the bullet kicked up a cloud of dust inches from Caleb's boots. And that was the final straw. The crowd erupted. They were no longer silent, no longer just observers. They were furious. Voices clashed like thunder. Men shouting, women screaming, the tide of their anger breaking free at last. Enough! A big rancher bellowed, surging forward, shoving his way through the circle. You'll murder a babe in daylight? Not in this town. Others followed him, their shouts becoming a storm. The square was boiling with rage as the sheriff spun, his revolver jerking wildly, his grip slipping under the overwhelming weight of their collective hate. Caleb's eyes stayed steady, locked on Maddox. The child remained pressed safe against his chest, and though the crowd surged like a wave about to break, he did not move. His calm was a rock that made the sheriff's rage look small, weak, and broken. And in that charged breath, just before the mob collided with their lawmen, the boy at Caleb's side whispered the words that cut through the roar, a quiet truth in the middle of the storm. Pa, it's still breathing. The square exploded into utter chaos. Voices collided like thunder as men surged forward and women dragged their children back, their faces pale. The once orderly circle of spectators collapsed into a storm of bodies and rage. Sheriff Maddox spun wildly, his revolver waving, his own voice completely drowned in the roar of fury that had finally broken free from its cage. Murderer! Someone bellowed from the back. He'd kill a babe for sport! Another cried, and suddenly stones, small at first, then larger, began to clatter against the wooden boards of the gallows. Dust flew in angry, choking clouds. Caleb Rowe tightened his arms around the infant, its thin wail sharp and piercing in the tumult. With his free hand, he pulled the boy close, shielding them both with the broad wall of his body. He was their anchor in the hurricane. The two deputies had completely faltered now. Their rifles were halfway raised, but they weren't aiming at Caleb anymore. Their eyes flicked nervously at the crowd, at the faces of their neighbors, faces that no longer stood behind the badge, but pressed forward with a hate that was terrifying to behold. Maddox, lost in his own madness, fired another shot. The bullet cracked into a post, splinters flying through the air. Women shrieked as the sound tore through their ears. The mob lurched back for a single heartbeat, shocked by the gunshot, then surged forward again, even braver now, their fury fueling their boots. Caleb shifted, stepping up onto the edge of the gallows platform, using its slight height to keep the crushing wave of bodies at bay. His jaw was set, his gaze steady on the sheriff, who now flailed in the dust, a tyrant losing his throne. You lost your law the second you aimed at this child, Caleb thundered, his voice carrying over the storm of the crowd. And the crowd roared in answer, a wave of agreement, fists shaking, curses spitting from their lips. Maddox's face blazed red, veins bulging at his temples. He shrieked, Silence! You'll obey me, or you'll all hang beside them. But his words rang hollow, brittle against the rising tide of rebellion. The big rancher who'd spoken before shoved forward, his powerful hand snatching the revolver's barrel, wrenching it violently to the side. The gun fired one last time, wild into the empty blue sky. Smoke curled upwards as a flock of birds scattered from the rooftops. Gasps tore through the mob, then louder cries. Suddenly, hands were grabbing at the sheriff's coat, dragging him, spinning him, shoving him toward the very gallows he had ruled from. Hang him with his own rope! Someone howled from the mass of people. The chant caught fast, a savage and hot rhythm, until the entire square shook with it. His own rope! His own rope! Maddox fought back, kicking and snarling like a cornered animal. His shiny badge glinted once in the sun as it was torn from his chest and flung into the dirt, immediately trampled beneath a dozen angry boots. The boy at Caleb's side pressed his face into his arm, trembling, whispering, Pa, they're going to kill him! But Caleb's eyes never left the child in his arms. Its tiny chest was fluttering, its breath shallow but miraculously steady. Not while I stand, Caleb muttered low. Though whether it was a promise or a prayer, even he could not say. The mob heaved, a single enraged organism, dragging Maddox hard against the central post. The rope dangled just above his head. His screams rose thin and shrill against their fury. The square seemed to tremble on the very edge of spilling blood. Caleb shifted, stepping down from the platform, back into the dust, his voice cutting low but fierce, a command born of hard-won wisdom. You hang him, And this child breathes in blood instead of hope. You decide right now what you want this town to be." His words struck a chord. They landed hard, freezing some, shaming others. For a breath, the rope hung still. The sheriff thrashed while the mob quivered, a beast torn between its lust for vengeance and the hard truth that had been laid bare before them. And then, like a whip crack, Maddox lunged. He ripped free of their loosened grip, shoving through the press of bodies. His eyes were wild, insane. A knife hidden in his boot was suddenly flashing in his fist as he spun toward Caleb and the babe. He was a beast cornered and desperate, ready to destroy the one thing that had brought him down. The steel gleamed, just inches from a life that had only just begun. The knife gleamed like fire in Sheriff Maddox's fist as he lunged. The crowd scattered with screams, boots grinding in panic as the mob that had hunted him now recoiled from the raw violence of his last stand. Caleb Rowe turned instantly, his arms a tight shield around the infant, its frail cry cutting the air. With his free hand, he shoved the boy hard behind him, his own body becoming a wall of flesh and bone, standing between the blade and the fragile breaths he carried. Maddox's roar tore through the square, his face twisted into an ugly mask, spittle flying. His badge was gone, his authority was gone, but his rage was burning hotter than the sun. The steel slashed close, so close Caleb felt the wind of it on his cheek. It grazed his sleeve. Sparks flew as the tip of the blade struck the hard wood of the gallows post. Caleb pivoted, his boot grinding deep into the dust, his voice a growl torn from somewhere old and raw. "You've spilled enough," he barked. He ducked the next wild swing. The bundle pressed so close against his chest he could feel its tiny heart beating against his ribs. The sheriff snarled, his eyes wild with madness. Each strike was more reckless than the last, more desperate. The knife carved deadly arcs in the air that drove the townsfolk back against the storefront walls. Women clutched their children, men cursed under their breath, but none of them moved to help. Their collective fury had been swallowed by individual fear. Bloodlust had turned back into terror. Caleb felt the baby stir weakly, its fragile weight a constant, desperate reminder that a single moment of hesitation meant death. With a sudden, explosive lunge, he moved in, catching Maddox's wrist in mid-swing. Their bodies collided with a grunt of impact, the knife shuddering to a halt inches from his throat. Gasps ripped through the watching mob. The struggle pulled both men down into the dirt. Caleb instinctively rolled to shield the child, his forearms straining against the sheriff's surprising strength. The boy screamed, "Pa!" his small fist beating uselessly at the dust while the crowd surged closer, but still dared not step in. Maddox's breath came in ragged, hot bursts of fury. His eyes were bulging as he pressed the blade down, sweat dripping from his brow onto Caleb's cheek. The drifter's teeth clenched, his muscles trembling with the strain. The knife edge bit so close he could smell the sharp tang of his own blood. With a roar that came from his very soul, he twisted, rolling them both over. He planted his boot hard against the sheriff's gut, shoving him back with all his might. The knife clattered once, but Maddox snatched it up again, scrambling to his feet, foam at his lips. "That child die!" he shrieked, lifting the blade high for a final fatal plunge. But in that exact moment, the infant let out a piercing wail. It was louder than it had been yet, a cry that was not weak, but strong and fierce, echoing beneath the gallows. The sound cut through the mob, silencing them, freezing even Maddox in mid-motion, the knife trembling in his raised grip. All eyes locked on the babe's chest, rising and falling, steady, strong, undeniable. Its cry was raw, but it was alive. Caleb's voice came low and fierce, carrying through the sudden hush. "You hear that, Sheriff? That's breath, and it ain't yours to take." Maddox roared again, a sound of pure animal rage, and slashed down. The crowd screamed as one, a wall of sound, as they saw steel fall toward the child's fragile frame. The knife came down in a blur of deadly steel, the crowd shrieking as mothers shielded their children's eyes, unable to watch. But Caleb twisted, his powerful shoulder slamming up into Maddox's arm, knocking the strike wide. The blade buried itself deep in the dirt with a dull, sickening thud. Dust exploded. The sheriff snarled, ripping the knife free for another swing. But Caleb surged forward, one arm still cradling the infant with impossible care, while his other hand clamped down hard around Maddox's wrist. The sheriff spat a stream of curses, his teeth bared, sweat dripping, the veins bulging in his neck as he strained to bring the blade back down for another strike. But Caleb's grip held, iron strong and unyielding. The baby wailed again, its cry high and fierce, cutting through the sounds of the struggle. And for the first time, the mob saw not fragility, but strength in that sound. It was a voice louder and more true than the sheriff's empty threats. "It's breathing!" someone shouted. It was a woman's voice, trembling yet sharp. The words rippled through the crowd like a spark catching on dry grass. "It breathes!" Another voice echoed, and the scattered murmurs turned to shouts, a chant that began to catch, to swell, a rising tide against the sheriff's roar. Maddox fought harder, desperate now, his knife jerking just inches from Caleb's cheek. But his eyes flickered at the sound of the chanting, fear twisting with his rage as the mob's cries grew louder and more unified. "It breathes! It lives!" Caleb heaved with a final massive effort, wrenching the sheriff's arm until a bone cracked with a sickening snap. The knife tumbled free at last, clattering across the dust until it came to rest against the boot of the big rancher, who promptly kicked it far beyond anyone's reach. Maddox screamed, a high, thin sound of pain, clutching his broken wrist. But the noise was completely drowned beneath the rising chorus of the town. The crowd pressed closer, no longer afraid, no longer silent observers. They saw the truth laid bare in the babe's cry, in the drifter's arms shielding it. It was life against death, defiance against cruelty. And they surged with it, fists shaking, their voices raw with emotion. Maddox staggered back, his face pale, his authority shattered into a million pieces. But still he shrieked, his voice cracking, "It's cursed! You're all cursed if it lives!" His words were hollow against the roar that rose like thunder, drowning him out completely. Caleb stood tall, the infant pressed close, his own chest heaving, dust clinging to his sweat-soaked shirt. His eyes were fixed steady on the lawman, who had lost his grip on everything. He lifted the bundle high enough for all to see, so they could witness the child's tiny chest rising and falling. It was proof, undeniable. "This is no curse," he shouted, his voice carrying over the mob, steady as bedrock. "This is breath, and you can't hang breath!" The crowd erupted, their voices breaking. Some were weeping, some were laughing with relief. The chant of "It lives" rolled through the square like a cleansing storm. Maddox's eyes darted wildly, his back hitting the gallows post. He was cornered by the very symbol of his power. His good hand clawed for a pistol that was no longer at his hip. The mob pressed closer, their collective fury shaking the wooden boards, their wrath a tide that no badge could ever stem now. Maddox's mouth foamed with rage, but his words died in the roar. His body trembled as he finally, completely, realized his power was gone. Caleb's boots shifted, his stance firm, but his gaze stayed locked on the sheriff, his jaw clenched. He was waiting for the moment when the town itself decided whether to break its tyrant or to bury him under the weight of his own cruelty. The mob surged as one body, their hands seizing Maddox's coat, dragging him hard against the very post he had ruled from. His screams were high and ragged as the gallows creaked above him. "String him up!" a man bellowed, his face dark with hate. The chant caught fast, savage and hot, fists shaking, boots pounding the dirt. The rope was swinging overhead, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Maddox kicked and clawed, spittle flying from his lips as he shouted, "I am the law!" But the words rang hollow, completely drowned beneath the roar of voices that no longer feared him, that no longer believed him. Caleb Rose stood rooted in the dust, an island of calm in the storm. The infant was pressed close to his chest, its small breath steady now, its cries spent into a quiet, exhausted silence. The boy clung to his sleeve, his eyes wide and terrified, trembling at the raw fury that boiled all around them. The big rancher flung the noose down from the beam. The coarse rope slapped against the sheriff's chest, and a dozen hands shoved it up toward his throat. Maddox thrashed, his face turning a deep purple, his eyes rolling wild in their sockets as he shrieked curses at the faces surrounding him. But the mob only howled louder, their vengeance a wild horse unchained. Caleb's jaw tightened, sweat running down his temple. He knew this look in their eyes all too well. It was the same blind rage he had seen on battlefields and in bloody backwater trails. It was a rage that cared little for who it swallowed, guilty or innocent. "Pa," the boy whispered, tugging his sleeve again. "They'll kill him." Caleb felt the child in his arms stir, the fragile life he had sworn to protect, pressed against his own heartbeat. He had to stop this. He stepped forward, his voice low but carrying, steady as a stone in a rushing river. "You hang him now, and you hang yourselves right beside him." The words cut through the rage of some. Their hands faltered, their eyes flicking with a sudden doubt. But others, their thirst for blood too strong, shouted back, "He aimed at a babe! He deserves the rope!" The mob strained, pulling Maddox higher, his heels digging trenches in the dust. His badge was gone. His power was gone. But his fury was unbroken. His voice was raw as he spat. "You'll all rot for this! You'll rot!" The rope slipped higher, brushing against the skin of his neck. Gas tore the air as the crowd leaned in close, breathless, standing on the very brink of spilling blood. Caleb raised the infant high again, its chest rising, falling. Proof. Undeniable. His voice thundered through the square, a final plea for reason. "This breath is the proof you need. Do you want it to start its life in blood, the same way its mother ended hers?" The hush that followed quivered, a town torn between its rage and its shame. But the mob still held Maddox fast, their fists trembling, their fury straining against the weight of Caleb's truth. The sheriff's eyes burned with a hate as thick as poison, and with a sudden, violent wrench, he ripped free of their uncertain grip. He wasn't lunging for escape. He was lunging for vengeance. His hand flashed to the hidden blade still strapped to his boot. Steel hissed as he swung. His snarl was a beast's last roar. He hurled himself directly toward Caleb and the child, his face twisted, his aim true, the knife driving straight for the fragile bundle of life cradled in the drifter's arms. The knife streaked through the air, steel flashing cruel and final in the sun, as Sheriff Maddox lunged. But Caleb was already moving. He twisted, his boot grinding deep into the dust, his free arms snapping up to catch the lawman's wrist in mid-swing. The crowd gasped, the sound sharp as a thunderclap. The boy cried out, "Pa!" as the infant wailed, its tiny cry piercing the chaos once more. Maddox snarled, spittle flying, his muscles straining as he tried to use his weight to drive the blade into the bundle pressed to Caleb's chest. But the drifter's grip was iron. His jaw was clenched, his eyes burning with a calm, cold fury that would not yield an inch. For a long heartbeat, the two men were locked in a deadly tableau. Every ounce of their strength trembled in their arms, the knife quivering just inches from the child's fragile breath. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the gallows itself, Caleb wrenched sideways, twisting the sheriff's wrist until the bone cracked with a loud, ugly sound. The knife clattered free, spinning across the dust where the rancher's boot pinned it fast. Maddox screamed, falling to his knees, clutching his ruined hand, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and terror as the mob surged closer once more. Caleb stood tall, the child held securely in his arms. Its cries were loud and certain now, its tiny chest rising strong, as if in defiance of the rope that had hung above it. He lifted the bundle high, his voice thundering over the stunned roar of the crowd. "It breathes, and no rope, no curse, no man can take that from it." The square fell completely silent. Every single face was turned to the sight of the drifter, scarred by dust and blood, holding the infant alive in his arms. The truth was too plain to deny. Some people began to weep openly. Others bowed their heads, shame heavy on their shoulders. A few men slowly uncurled their fists, their rage spent, replaced by a quiet awe. Sheriff Maddox staggered to his feet, his eyes wild, his power gone forever. His voice broke as he spat one last time. "It's cursed. You're all cursed." But no one was listening anymore. His own deputies turned their backs on him. The crowd parted, cold as stone, letting him pass. With nothing left but his fury and his pain, he stumbled away, his figure shrinking as he disappeared into the dusty alleys like a shadow already fading into memory. Caleb's chest heaved, the weight of the infant heavy but steady in his arms. He looked down and saw its lips part, a breath stronger than any before rising from its small chest. The boy at his side whispered, awe and wonder filling his voice. "Pa, it's really alive." Caleb bent his head, pressing his rough, dust-caked cheek to the child's soft head. His voice was low but firm, carrying just enough for those nearest to hear. "It's alive, son, and we won't walk away." He turned, walking away from the gallows with the boy at his side, the rope swaying uselessly above them. The mob stood silent behind him, their shame a ghost that would haunt the square forever. Step by step, Caleb carried the child out into the light, past the dust, past the rope, past the stain of cruelty that had tried to end what it could not. And as the afternoon sun poured gold over them, the cry of the infant faded into soft, steady breaths. A sound stronger than any gunshot, any rope, any curse. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to support more tales of justice on Echoes of the West. Now let me ask you, if you had heard that faint cry under the gallows, would you have walked away or would you have carried it into the light?